Okay, I think we directly move on to the keynote, which is really complementary to what we heard now. It's on regenerative agriculture. It's Professor Bruno Basso from Michigan State University. I met him 2 years ago at the conference. I heard his keynote there, and I was fascinated because it is really the solution-oriented approach to sustainability. It's about the challenge to make soil health a real business, and I think he succeeded in this. And I'm very happy that he agreed to join us here in Switzerland. And without further ado, I invite you to come to the floor. Thank you very much, Bruno, for joining.
Welcome. I think I use it.
Yeah.
It's truly a pleasure to be here today to share some of the latest thoughts on digital technologies and the critical role that they play both in leading innovation in agriculture and providing solutions also for the two keywords that we're using here, sustainability and resilience. So it is truly a segue of the previous panel, which it was fantastic. Really agree everything was except the cheese story being Italian. And Luis probably lived very close to one of the best Volpetti in Rome, right? Not too far from that. Anyway, jokes apart, Italians make great cheese as well, as you know. Presentation loading up, I think. So I will start with obviously briefly the challenges have been mentioned, and so it's really much more of an optimistic, talk, because the technology that I will share has really taken even much more than I expected in terms of adoption, not just by farmers, which obviously will lead any change, but also by the private sector, which obviously expedites adoption of technologies. So briefly, you've seen the challenges that agricultural face, grow, nutrition, food, animal feed. We need to continue to do that. As we heard, less water, less land, and there's not been much mentioning about how climate is changing, what is expected to happen, and the impact on agriculture. So I'll cover some of that, both illustrating concept of resilience as well as resistance. So be able to not even go under the shock or not as much. And that's what really we would like to build. I strongly support, the role of soil health, and so we need to protect soils by improving the biology of soils, trying to use, obviously, without chemistry is almost not fully possible to manage agricultural productions, but increasing biology is one of the topics, and soil health critical. Water, air quality, biodiversity, there's quite a bit of touching upon biodiversity, and as Luis said, the connection between the landscape, that biodiversity, it's really a result of spanning out of agricultural systems. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and so again, quite a big chunk of the talk will be around that. And at the same time, the role of sustainability in terms of economics is critical. Revenue streams for farmer, things were mentioned across the board, both through policies or rewarding farmers to be innovative or to potentially bear the risk if the solution that they were to bring into that farms would basically not necessarily lead to increasing yields, but additional benefits for the community. So the picture that you see here, there are additional threats, and urbanization is one of them, especially in areas, obviously, the mega cities that we all know, but even in the US. An example, the city of Houston, who sits on one of the most fertile soil, continues to basically sacrifice these very good soils for 600 square meter houses with 4 garages, and it's completely unsustainable. So we lose some of the best land for urbanization. Deforestation is declining, but still occurring. Land degradation, soil erosion. We lose a pound for every 50 kgs of corn that is produced across the Midwest. 4 tons per hectare, roughly. And close to where I live in the Great Lakes region, water quality is a major issue. One morning, the city of Toledo turned the tap and they thought they had green tea coming out rather than water as dark green, as consequences not just of agriculture, but also heavy industrial parks around the city of Detroit and Toledo. So agriculture is really not new to challenges. This is an example of the use of technologies and innovation through the green revolution technologies. So be able to couple improved genetics with varieties, again, genetics that were responsive to fertilizer. So you can see yield went from 0.8 to 3 tons so the typical Indian wheat production that Norman Borlaug, as you all know, the basically founder of Green Revolution, and the incredible amount of land saved. And so these graphics will show, without that technologies, how much more land we would have needed to use. So I had the pleasure, I spent time at Summit during my early phase of my career, and I had the pleasure to talk to him many times, and always being enlightening. I knew the background. It's just an incredible conference, but I knew no one will have a complete familiarity with agriculture. So very briefly, what have we faced in terms of really breakthrough and advancement? We have, the mechanization that allowed to cultivate much more land. That didn't come without a price. One of the worst environmental disaster, the Dust Bowl. And today in the US, we have the natural resource conservation because the President Roosevelt knew that basically the dust was coming to Washington, D.C., and all the Congress basically was able to see. And so they created the Soil Conservation Service. Later, with post-war, the possibility of using fertilizer, this powerful, from the Oberbosch system, what are we going to do with it? Let's put it in agriculture, and it really worked. That has fed the world, for sure. There's just no question about that. At the same time, misuse has led to additional environmental problems, as I mentioned, chiefly water quality or greenhouse gas emissions, being fertilizer and nitrous oxide, one of the major results of that. Then breeding and biotechnology, critical improvement that led to yield increase and continues to happen. I hope Europe embraces gene editing, because it's a critical step forward of innovation to allow increases in yield while maintaining a lot of other positive aspects related to the environment. Data science, we've all been exposed. It is actually a mixed definition of data science. Agriculture, it's partially exposed to data science. I mean, we are big data. We don't necessarily have lots of observation, but we do have huge amount of knowledge of data related to genomics or continuous surface from satellite imagery. But in terms of, having large, massive, data sets where the information were collected, we're still facing data scarce and data sparse information. So it's there are breakthroughs, and we recently published, is coming up in the next couple of weeks, how we couple ensemble process-based model with an ensemble AI to basically start generating synthetic data that could function as a part of the AI era that we all face. So what's present on going forward? Certainly, the opportunity of using computing powers, AI, and robotics across the board. Also fully agree what Louis said about the labor shortages in many, many places. It's just hard to basically harvest crops. And so robotics could be a partial solution. I mean, the problem say, is it going to put people out of work? Well, there are no people that would go in the field. And so some of again, without generalizing across robotics, both drones, and you'll see how we have projects about spoon feeding crops regularly by using drones. And so circularity, sustainability, and resilience will be, that train has left, is moving fast, is not, certainly not going back. I've spent some time working with economists looking at the bioeconomy. We have a large center at Michigan State on bioenergy, using marginal lands for and to create both bioenergy, sustainable aviation fuel, and bioproducts, aromatics. As you see on the big pictures, there is so much connection between all the sectors. Almost the word trade-offs is basically embedded everywhere. You mess the environment, you start messing health, and the politics, and so very strong connection about the general, the opportunity of the bioeconomy. The circular bioeconomy is becoming much, much more present. There is basically just about any research grants in the US. I don't know what to say in the last year or so, that things have changed so drastically that no one knows what's happening. The good thing about and unique thing about the US, that private sector and philanthropic are really stepping up to continue to allow us to advance science. And so the opportunity to go on a circular bioeconomy, it's happening. It will continue. In the case of agriculture, byproducts would be able to create, as you know well, fancy shoes from skin apples and stuff like that. Capture carbon, biomethane, and biogas, and so on. The SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel. I live close to the city of Detroit, where Delta is one of the hubs, investing a multi-billion-dollar investment in sustainable aviation fuel. The story is not fully clean about whether it will come from, converting ethanol from corn into sustainable aviation fuel, or there is quite a bit of investment in using sustainable oil crop like Brassica, Carinata, Camellinas, and others on low productivity crops. So the principle of circularity lead me to introduce also regenerative agriculture within the system, high diversity, having nutrient cycling, animal integration, perennial systems, and precision conservation. I will mention what is really intended, the removal of low productivity areas that we can identify and trying to minimize soil disturbance. So increase resource use efficiency, eliminate pollution, recycle material, regenerate the system, and provide economic benefits are all the pillars of circularity, with the associated benefits, obviously, profitability, the farmer well-being, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, sequestering carbon accrual is critical for the biology and the soil health that I mentioned, biodiversity, soil health, and water quality. And another topic that we often now are challenged in terms of putting multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary teams is the One Health concept to improve the health of ecosystem, the health of food, and the health of farmers and the community. So one of the field of research that I dedicate most of the time, I've the privilege of leading a large lab of 35 members, and a big chunk of the research is really advancing, creating both algorithms, products, and solutions within the digital system, and who get significantly much more attention nowadays from the press. So this was an editorial on Forbes. I'll show you a little bit later, large coverage on the New York Times, and for what reason that we'll go over together. Farmers are bombarded with solutions, but unfortunately, everybody sells them, a small piece of a technology, thinking that is a solution, which is a small pixel of a bigger puzzle. And so they really get basically confused, hurt, and lose money, and lose basically the optimisms that should come from digital technologies. These are examples of in automated robotics of applying water differently for every single row, possibility of calculating carbon intensity score, knowing basically every single field, as you'll see in the next slide, vulnerability to water deficit versus water access within basically at 3-meter resolution. So this image you probably possibly have seen. It's still from the older satellites, but nowadays for this is our planet breathing and dying, and we can really detect a lot from above. And in the next couple of years, because of this large investment in satellites, each place on Earth will be covered twice with hyperspectral and sub-centimeter resolution. So it will be really difficult to hide anything or basically not be able to understand what is happening in these fields. The other piece of research that we do, my basically initial career has been always in using crop simulation models, and so linking the possibility of detecting things that happens in the farm, so growing plants on the computer while you basically see the plants in the field. So linking both proximal and remote sensing, multimodal ensemble, the opportunity of capture different type of models, different model structures, understanding yield stability and persistence in areas that they change over space and time, as you'll see in a little bit. So carbon intensity, as I mentioned, is one of the latest hot topics that farmers demand, because there's quite a bit of investment in basically sustainable sourcing as well as bioenergy crops. So I work globally, as you'll see, but the Midwest is an incredible area, and it's just gifted a meter deep soil of 3% organic matter or more. And as you can see from satellite of fluorescence, it is more photosynthetically active than the Amazon during the month of June, July, and August. So incredible opportunity to grow crops. There won't be much of a change of the food system in the Midwest anytime soon, just because of you can't grow much of anything else. Unfortunately, people have tried to grow lentils, for example, and a farmer says, I couldn't sell it to a pet shop just because there is no market for it. And there is no market for it because of the golden rules. I mean, big companies that say, we're going to have a reduction of growing corn and soybeans. And obviously they say, where is that movie being shown? It's really not happening. The biotech or the chemical company obviously are doing anything possible to help farmers make better decisions, but obviously they make a significant amount of profit, intercepting the farm bill, intercepting incentives, and making a significant amount of profit, while the farmers have a very small margin. These are fields that we monitor. We've been monitoring them over the years, and that's just to show where they are located. Activity data, a lot of knowledge. And I wanted to show a concept that one of the first technologies that has been really revolutionary in agriculture is the possibility of putting GPS on machinery. So we have had self-driving tractors since basically the late 90s. And the opportunity of measuring yield as the tractor drives by. And so you can see that every square meter we have a knowledge of how much basically has been harvested. When you use these algorithms, again, that are developed, yield, stability, understanding spatial and temporal variation, how each pixel changes over time versus over space, allows you to identify areas. Despite the fact that you could have 20 years of information, farmers seldom look at this integration of space and time. I have short memory about only the last few years, if so. And so the opportunity of having one layer of information, it allows you to understand which areas needs a tactical management versus which areas could be well off by having strategic information. So how much is basically decided ahead of time because they are stable, whether they are constantly underperforming or which they should receive significantly less input, or if they are constantly high performing, then they should be basically potentially reduce some of the inputs. And so I was able to do the same analysis across these 80 million acres of corn and soybeans. And so now you can click on any single field and be able to know the partition between high productivity versus low productivity and which part of the field fluctuates from one year to the next. and it doesn't fluctuate every single other year, but out of 10 years, you can have 7 years high productivity, but you have also 3 years of low productivity. Because it has passed, you also understand why those 3 years performed completely opposite way of the others. So we have expanded now the resolution. So this is a map of all the fields grown in Michigan. You can click on all of them and determine profitability and, again, opportunity to do prescription. So the lab sends prescription maps across all the US. Last year, we sent 50,000 prescription maps for farmers who we didn't know. And they're part of a project where they get rewarded by returning to us the as-applied map. So we give the prescription, they have to implement the prescription, and we get a response of what the prescription. So it's our rate versus what they did. So this is an example of farmers, 500 fields random that we took from the different databases. And you can see the yellow boxes have constantly underperforming, despite the fact that they had the same management of the high productivity areas. And so there's quite a bit of a large gap. And it really is not sustainable, make any sense to continue to invest large amount of inputs on low productivity areas. So what's next on those low productivity areas? First, we run crop simulation models. So this is one of the models. There are really two schools of thoughts. Wageningen has led the way in combination with the group at both at Michigan State with my former professor, Joe Ricci, or the University of Florida. And so we really have a good understanding of the system. They're not perfect, but they're able to reproduce the interaction between biotic, weather management, and in order to get output on yield, atmospheric fluxes, drainage, and do socioeconomic and environmental analysis. So the models basically, how do we give prescription that we know they're better at what the farmers are doing? Because you run the model over a long period of time and you understand the probability of occurrence that one rate performs over that particular field. So the rates are decided through the use of simulation models. The yield stability and in-season imagery allow to the selection of where the rate should be varied. And so for the first time, this is done at scale across hundreds of millions of acres. And this is an example of the prescription. You can only see how precise these machines are by changing the rates in each of those boxes has different rates. And now for the first time, the farmers sees on their own farms where basically even if you increase fertilizer on the low productivity areas, you just don't get the response. If you see the low and stable zones there in the middle, it doesn't matter if you even push to 250 kilograms per hectare, the yield still doesn't increase versus the areas where you could boost yield by having deeper soil. And so it's mostly related to soil depth and the available water. And so this has been extremely important. But we really got the attention of the farmers to do the study when we show them analysis of profitability. So we convert the yield maps, not just for 1 year, this historical, and create this profit stability map. So not just 1 year, but over an historical period of time, and basically see that the parts in red, they lose $200 per acre. And any entrepreneur will never basically continue to do that. If you had a store, you will remove immediately the aisle that is not selling versus another that it is. And so that has been paramount. And so the next thing, in addition to the variable rate, we provide prescription on eliminating, substituting these low productivity areas with this concept of precision conservation. So the profitability map helps the farmer see these are big areas. So as you probably quickly went over the entire Midwest, there are 25 million acres of constantly low productivity areas across the Midwest. That doesn't mean no productivity. It means 5 tons versus 10 tons. And now in the mix, and because of the insurance program that they have cushion. But it doesn't justify the fact that they lose so much, greenhouse gas emissions. And so we found that basically 80% of the area, it's productive, it does, but creates the 80-20% rule. So the 80% of pollution comes from 20% of the land. Because the high productivity areas, they do need the inputs. They need to be able to get this 15, 16 rain-fed without irrigation. So from the profitability map, you get to which area responds to fertilizer versus which areas should be basically removed and be used with a different land use. In this case, it's native pollinators, which is different than prairie strips, where you have small strips in the middle of the field, which could even take some of the productive areas. So these are areas that they weren't performing well, and now they basically allocated to generate ecosystem services. And so in the end, this profitability map now changes from being, economics coming from the corn yields of the high productivity and incentives and innovation, rewarding farmers for carbon accruals. And so this is a really trigger both philanthropic investment, but also CPGs, consumer packaged goods, that really want to have, the grains to be associated with the biodiversity check and the opportunity to have, greater yield. So this is an example how the farmers, plant these pollinators across the field. And so in addition to the prescription map, we give biodiversity conservation areas map. So which area, and that sometimes there could be entire fields. Now, if you worry about leakages turning and says, oh, that's a large amount that food is not produced, that is actually offsets. The calculation is a little bit more complex to do, but it's not really justified to, continue to have huge environmental impact, greenhouse gas emissions from areas that even drains farmer down over these large economic losses. And so this got, because it has been implemented on over thousands of acres, we have beautiful evidence of fact-checked journalism, what the current president does not like. And so we have basically, they talked to all the farmers that implement biodiversity areas. And so the New York Times gave this incredible article. And so farmers here apply fertilizer using basically spraying drones. So frequently 12 times versus 1 time that they used to do. And the greenhouse gas emissions have been basically decreased by 70% just by spoon feeding through our prescription maps and frequently go in the field, which you obviously watch the weather and whether you have the available water to take the nutrients and so on. So modeling, remote sensing, and the stability map play a critical role. Now, changing gears towards, again, what I meant has not necessarily been covered. Things have not changed dramatically because thanks likely to Europe and some of the regulations. So last year there were over 23,000 firms that disclosed on climate impact. And so that's a very important, promising, and it continues to happen. This is obviously for the components agriculture is voluntary, but it's happening. And in a very simplified version of the carbon cycles, we take carbon out of the bowel of the earth, combustion, goes into the atmosphere, allow us to live on the planet because of, the greenhouse allows to have the temperature that we have, allows to do photosynthesis. Biomass gets converted into roots and residues back into the soil. Then unfortunately, they still decompose the bio. So carbon, the same molecule of carbon is not permanent all the time. But if you keep adding more than you transpire, basically you respire through solar respiration, then you have carbon accrual. And so this is the perfect example of how we want to regenerate a system by having minimal disturbance and all the associated practices that have perennials and improved biology, as I mentioned, because you will increase water storage, biological activity, better aggregation, yield, resilience, and profit, and that I'll get in a minute. So the change is inevitable, but it doesn't matter how much of innovation occurs. It takes time to convert these shifting sciences to an immediate translation. And that's just not because we have many more technical solutions. We need to work with social scientists and be able to make them aware of what are some of the limitations in this technology and be able to work closely. And this is an example, the soil health principle that, are really taking place a little bit more because of another driver, the transparency, higher demand from, at least in the Western world, more transparency how the food is produced. And so the transdisciplinary partnership and system approach is critical to basically get ahead, enable change towards sustainability and resilience. So recently we published this paper running multiple models and quantify at a high resolution the impact of regenerative practices across the US, all the 100 million acres. One aspect which is critical is helping farmers understand the risk. And so what is risk? It's a combination of this equation. What is the hazard? How much is the exposure in terms of the spatial extent? So you have extreme drought, you have followed by deluge in the same season. You have parts of the countries where basically have a possibility of coming back from the shock. Others don't even get impacted from the shock. They're more resistant versus others that do not even come back. So knowing the exposure, the hazard, it allows us to quantify the vulnerability. And this is a project with some of the high food companies that are interested in sustainable supply chain and resilience. Modeling helps to understand that when you make a change in practice adoption, you also have to understand the counterfactual. What would that practice would have led to? So you could have, it's very important to understand, especially in the carbon market space, that if you adopt a technology, you cannot expect that the carbon does not change, in these 10 years, because you could have these three cases where you could have, let's say the conventional tillage still loses carbon, but not as much as expected or compared to the static baseline. And so that's really the difference. There are many cases where they divert much far apart. And so that's even greater, rewards. But there are parts where soil carbon sequestration, because of the low inputs and, complexity of the management or the climate and the system interaction, may not generate any carbon accrual, which takes really long time. But if you were to stay in the same practice, then you would have basically reward the farmer for the cost of not doing something and be able to do that. So now we have a system, again, on the digital platform, on the digital twin that we're building. You can click on any of these fields and be able to understand the counterfactual and the carbon accrual. This is a partial story. You need to understand there is such a carbon tunnel vision just on the soil carbon. There is a critical other component, which is N2O emissions, which is nearly impossible to measure except, research settings. And so here, this is the map of the difference between the N2O emissions minus the carbon sequestration. And no-till plus cover crops basically would allow you to quantify the difference to the conventional tillage and identify areas where, if you don't grow enough cover crop, at least you are aware that you may never reach the greenhouse gas mitigation. So that's very important to quantify what-if scenarios before the farmers gets in. So just to move a little faster and trying to finish the last few slides, SIBO Technologies is one of the startups that it's a spin-up of all these patents coming from this work. And it basically helps you quantify sustainability index, a score. It brings you transparency to the value of the land by knowing what is the yield stability, what fraction of that field is constantly underperforming. If you buy a car, you know how many kilometers that car has done. If you buy a house, you can do an inspection. If you buy a parcel of land, you can't poke a hole, or you have asymmetric information. The farmer knows a lot more selling to you than what you. And so this has basically sparked the interest of a lot of land investments. And so the opportunity, again, to link the improved management, quantification of spatial variation brings a significant amount of opportunity for farmers to transition into regenerative practices and selling the carbon accrual or the reduction on emissions. And these are the amount of money that they could potentially be allocated. To finish, there is the most important word in agriculture you have to understand is complexity of the system and trade-offs. There is just, you can't have everything. You fix one thing and you have a problem someplace else. And so be able to understand, this is a recent paper we published in PNS last week, and it's basically understanding, you can see the upper figure, resilience versus, water drought versus excessive amount of water across management intensity. If you do only corn, if you do corn and soybeans, if you do extended rotations, or what we call an aspirational treatment, where 2 years in the rotation you will get forage back, and so you have rotational grazing. And so quantifying the ecosystem services and the economics has helped. There's just no time possible to go through all the numbers, but I encourage you, if you're interested, I'll send you the paper. So we can identify this resilience and the best practices across the space. There is no solution fits all across the space and time. So modeling and the integration with the digital twin and remote sensing allows you to be able to do that. To finish, we have a really large project now that is led by the former Vice President Al Gore on climate trace. We basically detect, we check on the reporter that the country do self-reporting. So using modeling AI and remote sensing, I encourage you to see the system, freely available information about all the sectors, the greenhouse gas emissions. So ideally, we need to move from a linear system with all what you see there in the picture, inefficiency over space and time, confined animal facility operation, having, water standing, not capturing resources, and versus a circular system where you have an improvement across throughout the system. So I'll conclude with these slides. I am also optimistic, and we just, each of us has to do a role. Transdisciplinary education and science will hopefully lead us to a more sustainable and resilient food system. And obviously, without the dedicated and interest, motivation of these students and scientists, this work will not be possible. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. I think this gave us really a glimpse into the future of agriculture, and I'm really happy that you were agreeing to join here, because it's really at the core of this whole conference that new technologies can be combined with ecological approaches, and it can become financially sustainable, right? And that's what you prove with your company. Do you see that the disruptive new administration might endanger this business model, or will you be able to survive these 4 years?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, but it's so ridiculous that we had to change mostly the wording. I mean, there is still a lot of interest in the agricultural sector because obviously he also got voted because of the support from the rural areas. Priorities on increasing yield rather than ecosystem services. When you increase yield, you have all kinds of additional benefits coming from it. Like I said, the private sector is still moving towards disclosure, and nothing has changed except the sequestration of funding to science. So I lost a significant amount of money because I was working on climate change or trying to help underrepresented community, which I don't understand why they shouldn't be helped anymore. So that's that. I don't think it will change because agriculture is a critical sector. There is actually an extension of investments for sustainable aviation fuel, which is a paradox because he wants to have oil. But someone told him that stop saying, drill, baby, drill, because the price is already too down. And so there are lots of interesting dynamics occurring. But the importance of agriculture and innovation, it's still highly present even now.
Fantastic. Now, I don't know, do we have time for questions, or do we need to? Okay, then we have to break now. There will be a picture, I heard. So they wanted to make a picture, but definitely we'll follow up this discussion also when it comes to the next panel, where there is a link to agriculture again. But generally, I don't know, is there one urgent question you want? I mean, we have already got, yeah.
So I really appreciate your presentation, but you have a huge dependence on data. And the President Trump, he wants to close NCAR, for example. So is there an effort to try and get all the farmers to say, no, we need this data, we need the satellites, we need the input for the models?
Yes, very, very good point. I don't think we are at that stage. I mean, NCAR was penalized because of the climate work. And obviously, we need climate data. Luckily, there is still Europe or Australia or many other places, that you would. It's such a critical, aspect of collecting data that will fit into these models. The farmers are realizing how much, basically damage they are, facing, because the most important one is the lack of markets. And so understanding that they don't want welfare, they always want to see a market that they can sell the product. So that's a common conversation. We have NASA powered data or many others. And through, both the sensors, they kind of left that aspect out. NCAR was just basically a capricious approach on the climate, which is really bad.
Okay, and the rest of the questions, hopefully in the coffee break, one will also be, can this be applicable to European agriculture? Probably, but I leave that to the break, because I see they are already
Perfect.
Patiently.
Thank you. Sorry to keep you here longer.
No, it was fantastic. Thanks.